2009, the Jamison family, which was Bobby, who was 44, Sherilyn, who was 40, and their daughter Madison, who was 6 years old, were living in Eufaula, Oklahoma on lakefront property. While they seemed to be living a simple and happy life, behind the scenes, their life was in turmoil. Bobby suffered from bad chronic back pain that he had as a result of a car accident that he was in 2003. Sherilyn was bipolar. She was medicated for it, but she didn't always take her meds, causing her to lash out at her family members, and it caused bouts of severe depression. Bobby and Sherilyn also believed that their house was haunted by 3 or 4 spirits who lived on their roof. Bobby was so convinced of this that he went to his pastor and asked where he could buy special bullets that he could shoot at these spirits. So for all of these reasons, the Jamison family was actually looking to leave their property in Eufaula and move somewhere else and hopefully start all over again, fresh, with a new shot at happiness. After the Jamisons would vanish, their family and friends would say, "We had no idea any of this was happening. We had no idea they were even considering a move." Now, this move they were considering was not a typical move. They were not looking to move into another house. They were looking to move onto a piece of property where they could place their storage container and live in the storage container until at some point they were going to build a house on a mountain and then move into the house. And they had actually already found a plot of land about 30 miles away from where they were currently living in a town called Red Oak. Now, the storage container itself that they planned on living in was actually sitting on their property in Eufaula, and it drew a lot of attention from the neighbors because Sherilyn would graffiti on it, "The neighbors have poisoned our cats. Witches don't like it when you kill their cats," because it turns out Sherilyn believed that she was a witch. So unsurprisingly, the neighbors avoided the Jamison family at all cost. Several weeks before the Jamison family went missing, they actually brought in a male boarder, so a guy that was going to live with them and help with manual labor in exchange for room and board. The boarder was a white supremacist that immediately took exception to Sherilyn, who was part Native American. And so anytime Bobby was out of the house, the white supremacist boarder would get into a fight with Sherilyn. And one day it came to a head and Sherilyn drew a gun on the boarder and said to leave the property or she was going to shoot him. The boarder refused to leave, and so Sherilyn began firing shots into the ground at his feet until he left. Now, once the Jamison family disappeared, this white supremacist boarder became one of the primary suspects. But when the FBI found him, he had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly crossed off the list of potential suspects. On October 8th, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, their daughter Madison, and their dog Maisie load up the truck and they start driving towards Red Oak. They were apparently going to go scout out this piece of property that they wanted to purchase to live on with the storage container. Now, according to family and friends, it was not uncommon for the Jamisons to vanish for several days at a time without telling anybody where they went. And it would turn out that they would go into the woods for these retreats where they would get away from technology and the city. When they were gone for a few days and no one had heard from them, no one thought twice about it. On top of this, Bobby and Sherilyn had informed Madison's school that they'd be pulling her out of class because they were going to be moving. So when Madison didn't show up for school, the school did not raise any alarms because they assumed she'd been pulled out of school. On October 16th, 2009, 8 days after the Jamisons had left their house to go scout out this property in Red Oak, a couple of hunters in the Panola Mountains, which is near Red Oak, found the Jamisons' truck parked on the side of the road. Now, these hunters are in the middle of nowhere, which means the truck is in the middle of nowhere. And so as they're walking over to it, they're expecting to see the owner of the truck. But as they get over to the truck, there is no owner anywhere. They called out a couple times to see if they could get this person's attention or whoever it was that owned it, and no one came over to them. They look in the truck and they see there is this very sick-looking dog sitting on the back seat. It would turn out it was the Jamisons' dog. It was Maisie. Now, the windows were up and the truck was locked, so the hunters called the police. Police show up, they break a window, and they get Maisie out of the truck. They give her food and water, and she would end up making a full recovery. They look in the vehicle and all of the Jamisons' personal effects are in there. Their phones, their wallets, their jackets, their clothes. Underneath the front seat was $32,000 of cash in a bank bag. Also, they found this weird letter written by Sherilyn to Bobby that was this 11-page hate letter that basically accused Bobby of being a hermit, which seems like a strange thing to ramble for 11 pages about, but either way. The police did an initial search of the area looking for the Jamison family, but they couldn't find them. And so the running theory was they must have pulled over and walked into the woods for some reason, got turned around, and they're just lost, and we need to go find them. The police were able to use the cell phones that had been left inside of the vehicle and were able to use their GPS locations and track where the phones had been before coming to rest inside of this vehicle. And they saw that the cell phones had actually gone up the trail a little ways. They had been up towards the top of the mountain for about 15 minutes before coming back down and then wound up in the truck where they were when they were found. So the police walk up the hill to where the GPS said they had been, and they find all these footprints that look to be Madison's because there's a child's footprint as well as probably Bobby's and Sherilyn's. But they're nowhere to be found, and there's no clue of where they went after being up there. When they started scanning through each of the cell phones to see if there was any information about where they might have gone, they found on Bobby's phone a picture of Madison that was taken up at that little location that the GPS took them. The picture of Madison has been hotly contested on the internet for a long time now. It's hard to tell in the image if Madison is happy or sad. It's also unclear based on her body language if her parents are taking the photo or if this was kind of staged by someone else. So between the GPS showing that they had been at the top of this mountain at one point, plus the picture of Madison confirming she had at least been up there, the police started this massive search with that section on the mountain where they had been standing as kind of the center point. And they searched all around the Panola Mountains. But after an extensive search of this new area, they didn't find anything. No new leads had come in, so ultimately the search was called off. 4 years later, in November of 2013, some hikers were in the Panola Mountains, about 5 kilometers, maybe a little bit less, from where the Jamison truck was found, and they come across skeletal remains of 3 individuals. It looked like 2 adults and a child. They were laying face down side by side, and it was clear that they were not complete skeletons, but there was enough there to know for sure that these are people. As soon as the police were called, everybody assumed this has to be the Jamison family. It would actually take almost a year before they were able to confirm that yes, those bones are in fact the Jamison family. While the Oklahoma medical examiner was not able to determine a cause of death because the remains were just partial, they didn't have enough to work with, they did see that there was a big hole in the back of Bobby's skull and there was other holes in some of the other bones that many people assumed were from bullets, but it was never determined if that actually was what it was from. As soon as it came out that it was the Jamison family's remains, the first prominent theory was that this had to have been a murder-suicide, where Sherilyn, who was mad at Bobby, she wrote that hate-filled 11-page letter that was found in the car. You know, she's unstable from not taking her medication to combat her bipolar disorder. She seems like the person that would take her family out and then turn on herself. But all of her family said she would never harm her daughter. I mean, maybe she would have harmed Bobby, but she never would have harmed her daughter. Also, why would you have brought your dog along and left your dog in the car and $32,000 of cash in the car? So that doesn't fit that scenario at all. The next theory was, well, maybe they just pulled over, walked into the woods for some reason, and then got lost and died of exposure. And that's still definitely a possible theory, except at the time they went missing, the temperatures were very mild. They were not dropping below freezing at night. It didn't rain very much, so it was kind of perfect conditions to be lost in the woods. It would have taken quite a while for them to die from exposure. And if you add in the fact that they were searching that area that they were found in pretty extensively within a few days of them going missing. If they had been lost and were only a few kilometers from the road, they would have been found in that search, but they weren't. The next theory that friends and family of the Jamison family predominantly believe is they were kidnapped. That maybe, they were driving on that road and someone flagged them down, whether it was someone they knew or someone that did not seem threatening, that caused them to get out of their car and come over to them, leaving their car the way it was with all of their belongings inside and with their dog inside, shut the door, they're not threatened. They walk over to this person or this group, and then something happens where they are either against their will or they're complicit, and they walk into the woods, never to go back to their truck, and then they ultimately pass away in the woods just a few kilometers away. However, none of those theories can account for the very bizarre video footage that they have of the Jamison family on the day they left their house to go check out the property in Red Oak. So on October 8th, 2009, the video shows Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips, about 20 or more, from their house to their truck, where they're loading gear into their truck. But they appear to be almost in a trance, which is what the sheriff said when he first saw the video. They're walking back and forth and they're carrying their stuff into the truck, but periodically they're making trips without carrying anything. They're just walking to the truck with nothing in hand, looking at the truck, and then walking back to the house. And then they come back out and they have something in their hands, and then the next trip they have nothing. And periodically on their trek back and forth, they would just stop and just turn and look off into the distance, not interacting with each other. Bobby and Sherilyn haven't spoken to each other at all. They're just doing this weird trance-like commute back and forth between truck and house before ultimately they load up the truck and they do leave. A lot of people speculated that, well, it looks like Bobby and Sherilyn must have been using drugs. But when they first found the truck and they searched the Jamison's truck and they searched the Jamison family house, there was no traces of drugs anywhere, and their family said there's no history of drug abuse. There was also a theory that perhaps the Jamison family got tied up in a cult, and that was why they were moving and they were going to live this minimalist lifestyle, and they had brought cash to give to this cult, but in fact they had actually been the target of the cult, and that was what led to their demise. Or maybe they were complicit and they wanted to sacrifice themselves or something, but no one really knows. There is this tiny, lush, heavily forested, beautiful island 93 miles off the coast of Brazil that no matter how beautiful it looks, no one will go to this island. In fact, you're not allowed to go to it because the Brazilian Navy has forbid it. So the legend of this island really began in the early 1900s when a local fisherman was off the coast of the island and saw right on the edge of the forest were these beautiful banana trees with all these bananas that were ripe and ready to be picked. And he thought, I can easily pull my boat over to those rocks over there, hop out, grab some bananas and bring them home, no problem. That'll take me, 10 minutes to do. And so he pulls over by himself to get these bananas. He anchors his boat, he walks up the beach, he climbs up the tree and he starts hacking down some bananas. And while he's up there, he suddenly feels a sharp pain on his rib cage. And he falls out of the tree and he looks down and he's bleeding out of his rib cage because he can see it on his shirt. There's blood on his shirt. Was there a branch that jabbed me in the side? Like, what was that? And he's alone. He's 93 miles from the mainland. And so in a panic, he ditches the bananas, he runs to his boat, gets it unanchored, and starts making his way back to the mainland. But on the trek back, he passes out in the boat. Later that day, another group of fishermen see this boat kind of drifting around near some rocks, and it looks like something's wrong, so they make their way over to it, and there's this fisherman who went to get the bananas, but he's lying on his back. He's clearly dead, and he's in a pool of his own blood. 20 years after this incident, there was a lighthouse keeper that was assigned to work on this island, and he brought his family with him. They were staying in the main house of the lighthouse, and it was going fine for the first couple of days they were there. But at some point, captains of vessels that would drive past this island and relied on that lighthouse noticed that the light wasn't on. And so they reported it to the mainland, and a search party was sent out to check on the lighthouse keeper and his family to make sure that they had all their supplies and that they were okay. When they get to the lighthouse, they find the entire family is dead in their bed. And the only clue they had were these puncture marks all over the bodies of these deceased lighthouse keepers and an open window. So what killed these people that went to this island? Technically, they died from a poison that literally melts your organs within 60 minutes of coming in contact with it. But that poison comes from a very famous venomous snake called the golden lancehead viper that only exists on this island. They exist nowhere else in the world. And so this island has been dubbed Snake Island. And since nobody goes to this island, the lancehead viper population has exploded. They are thriving on this island. In fact, researchers say that there's at least 3,000 of these venomous snakes that live on this island, and for every 1 square meter of the island, there is a snake, which means if you're on this island, you are always within 1 meter of something that can kill you. And these snakes aren't just on the ground either, because their primary food source are birds, and so the snakes have begun to live in the trees and catch birds that land in the trees. Meaning, if you happen to be walking on this densely forested island, you'd be surrounded almost 360 degrees by these wickedly venomous snakes that if you are bit, you have 60 minutes to get the antidote. If you don't, you're doomed 100% of the time. Nowadays, the only people that go to this island are the Navy, who replace the batteries in the lighthouse, which is now automated because it's too dangerous to be there. They go once a year to replace those batteries. Researchers occasionally go there, and you have poachers that go to try to catch some of these snakes because they're so rare, they can sell on the black market for 10 to 30,000 US dollars. But many of these poachers that manage to sneak onto the island just get bit by these vipers and die. So there you go, karma. In early 1945, during World War II, the British decided they wanted to take back Ramree Island from the Japanese. Ramree Island is a fairly large, totally flat island off the coast of Burma that was a great staging location to fly air campaigns onto the mainland. So it was a great air base. And the British had actually owned this island, but the Japanese had taken it back from them in 1942. And so here they are in 1945 looking to take it back. So on January 21st, 1945, British and Indian infantry stormed the beaches of Ramree to try to take it back. As soon as they land, they have all this naval artillery support just bombing the crap out of this airbase, and it was just a matter of time before they overwhelmed the remaining Japanese. But the Japanese do not want to surrender, and instead they give up the airbase that they were on, so the British take that back, and the remaining 1,000 Japanese soldiers started retreating to the opposite end of the island, to where there was a much larger battalion of Japanese soldiers that they could meet up with. But the only issue with this particular retreat was they would have to go through 10 miles of mangrove swamp where there's poisonous spiders and insects and deep mud, making it almost impossible to move. But they're determined and they head off into the swamp. But what the Japanese were not ready for is what Ramree Island is famous for: a creature that makes poisonous snakes and spiders and insects look like child's play. And they were walking directly into its den. The British troops decided we're not going to go chasing them into the swamp. And instead what they did is they set up boats, blocking positions outside of the swamp. If any of the Japanese tried to escape, they would be there waiting. And so the only way the Japanese could get out of there would be to go to the absolute other end, 10 miles away, where their Japanese counterparts were. So that night, as the British are just kind of hanging out in their boats staring at the swamp, they start hearing screams coming from inside of the swamp, and it's Japanese soldiers. Then you hear gunfire and then silence. And then it would start all over again. All over this huge swamp was just screams, gunfire, silence. Screams, gunfire, silence. And the British are watching this like, do we have troops in there? What's going on in there? What was going on in there is defined by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest massacre of humans caused by animals. And not just any animal, saltwater crocodiles. These massive man-eating crocodiles can weigh up to 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. They can grow to be 7 meters in length or about 23 feet in length. And National Geographic has labeled these crocodiles as the most likely to eat a human of all animals. And Ramree Island has the largest population of saltwater crocodiles in the world, and they all lived inside of the swamp that the Japanese had gone into. A lot of them were bleeding from the battle they were in, and so they were literally alerting hundreds of saltwater crocodiles to their location. Saltwater crocodiles are notorious night hunters. So what probably happened is the Japanese got inside of this mangrove. The crocodiles were immediately aware of their presence, but they waited until nighttime before they started having a feeding frenzy. And over the course of the night, a number of Japanese soldiers had jumped out the sides of the swamp, exposing themselves to the British. And so about 20 of them were captured, and they said that they were completely surrounded by these crocodiles, that everywhere you looked, there were growling, huge crocodiles eating one person, and as soon as they were done, they would just charge after you and eat you. And at the end of their retreat, when the Japanese did get to the other side of the swamp, only 500 of the 1,000 made it out the other side. And so to this day, people stay far away from Ramree Island because there are so many of these man-eating saltwater crocodiles that have no issue ripping you to shreds. On November 14th, 2018, John Chow hired 2 fishermen to take him out to this little island in the Indian Ocean. The fishermen were not excited about this, not only because it was illegal to take him out to the island, but because the last time some fishermen had gone to this island, they had both died. But the fishermen needed the money, and so they went with John and they drove under the cover of darkness to this island, and they anchored a little ways offshore. The next morning when the sun came up, John asked the fishermen to take him in a little bit closer, but the fishermen refused. So John puts a kayak in the water and he begins paddling into this island. And as he gets close to the actual beach, he sees someone come out of the forest who has their face painted yellow, and they're screeching at the top of their lungs. And John yells out that he's not threatening them, he just wants to come ashore and talk to them. And then a wave of people with yellow painted faces come charging out of the wood line and start firing arrows in his direction. So John, in a panic, turns around and paddles right back out to the fishing boat. Later that day, John tries to make another attempt at landing on this island and communicating with the people that live there. So he takes his kayak and he goes down a little bit farther away from where those people had emerged from the tree line earlier in the day and shot him with arrows. He figured he was a little bit farther out of arrow range this way. He lands his kayak, he gets out, and the same group of people come out farther down the beach where they had been before. They see John. They all start looking at each other and they start screeching and running down the beach towards John. John stands there until they come all the way up to him. They don't shoot him with arrows, but they take his kayak, and they don't really know what to make of him. They're staring at him and they start speaking to each other in a language John doesn't understand. And then at some point, a child pulls his bow and arrow out and fires a bow directly at John. And he was holding a Bible and he stopped the arrow with his Bible. And at that point, John is like, okay, I gotta go. And he jumps in the water and without a kayak has to swim a mile to get back to the fishing boat. The whole time, these people are firing arrows arbitrarily in his direction as he's swimming back out to the boat. And so the next day, on November 16th, he told the fishermen he wanted them to drop him off and he would swim in, and he wanted them to leave and be completely out of sight. The fishermen did not want to do this, but John reassured them that he was going to be just fine, he knew what he was doing, and so the fishermen drop him off and they leave. The next day, when the fishermen come back to collect John, they see these people with painted yellow faces out on the beach dragging his body by a rope. No one knows exactly what happened to John, how they killed him. There's lots of speculation about how it went down, but it's too dangerous for anyone to go back and retrieve his body, and so his body remains at North Sentinel Island. The few hundred people that live on North Sentinel Island that were responsible for killing John Chow, they're referred to as the Sentinelese, and they are unbelievably primitive. They are completely cut off from the modern world. They live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They have no conception of agriculture. They haven't even discovered fire yet. They literally have to wait for lightning to strike and then run and collect the embers and try to keep the embers alive. Researchers believe that the Sentinelese are direct descendants from the earliest human ancestors that came out of Africa. And as much as we'd like to learn more about the Sentinelese, we probably won't, because they aggressively resist outside contact. They won't even let the other similarly primitive neighboring island tribes to come on their island. The Sentinelese want only Sentinelese on that island. No one else can be there. If you're not a Sentinelese and you try to go to their island, they'll just kill you. On October 16th, 1930, John Sullivan, who was with his nephew, Lawrence Sullivan, who was only 3 years old, they were driving together in the middle of the Nevada desert. They were about 150 miles away from Reno in this very remote area. John was a gold prospector, and he was heading to an area that he wanted to scout out and see if it was a proper place to prospect for gold. This area, the roads didn't even go to it. You had to drive down this road where it just kind of dead ends in the middle of the desert, right near this huge steep mountain range, at which point you needed to park your car, get out, and then walk over this hill right in front of where the road ends, and it was going to be over that hill looking down into this valley where John wanted to prospect. So he drives down the road, he parks the car, and he turns to Lawrence and he says, "Hey, I'm going to go over this hill for a minute and check the area out. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Stay in here, don't leave the car, I'll be right back." John gets out, he locks the car, he walks up to the top of the hill, and he turns around, looks at Lawrence, and waves at him. Lawrence looks up at his uncle and he waves back and he's smiling. So clear interaction. Lawrence knows where John is and where John's going. John can clearly see Lawrence. There's no one in the area too. I'm talking, this is remote as remote can be. You're just right up against this mountain. That's the only thing going on in this area. So John turns his back on Lawrence. He goes over the hill. He's now out of sight of the vehicle and he does a short inspection of this area that he wanted to prospect. He goes back up over the hill and he sees immediately that the door is now open and Lawrence is not in the vehicle anymore. John is not immediately concerned because it's only been a couple of minutes. He can't have gone very far, and there's nowhere to even go. There's no trees. I mean, basically, it's just this mountain right here. But beyond the mountain, there's really nowhere to go. So he goes down, he looks in the car, he looks under the car, he's yelling for Lawrence, no response. And sound carried really well in this area. After a little while, and he can't hear anything, he hasn't seen Lawrence, he's starting to get very desperate because they are in the middle of nowhere and the temperatures are going to drop well below freezing at night. So John has to make this totally painful decision to get in his car and drive and get help. And so he leaves Lawrence because he can't find him. He gets help. The sheriff comes out there and they start this massive search for this child. This whole time, John is convinced someone had to abduct him because Lawrence knew where John was. If he was to get out of the vehicle, let's say, he would have walked over the hill to where John was. John was just on the other side of the hill. It doesn't make any sense that Lawrence would get out and wander in a different direction. He would have gone to John. They were very close. He might have wanted to see what he was doing on the other side of the hill. In the first few days of the search, they can't find any tracks of the child or another person that could have potentially abducted him, or even tracks of an animal that could have potentially taken Lawrence away. There's just nothing. They did find his hat, but that was it. There's no other evidence to go off of. And so after 4 days of searching, the newspapers began running headlines about potentially an eagle swooping down and taking Lawrence away, because that's all anyone could speculate given the fact that there was no tracks anywhere and that his hat had fallen off. At this point, the police feel totally helpless. They don't understand how this child has managed to evade capture. They're not ready to accept that an eagle has taken him away. And so the police bring in a Native American tracker who was known in the area as an exceptional tracker. So this tracker comes in and manages to pick up a partial trail of this child. And he starts following it, and they get 7 miles away from where this boy went missing. And the tracker begins going up the side of this cliff. They have to actually bring in climbing equipment to get up this cliff. They go 1,400 feet up this cliff. So over 400 meters, they're going up this sheer cliff with climbing equipment. And they get all the way up there, and there's this one little shelf, this one little rocky shelf that this tracker has brought them to. And sure enough, on this shelf is Lawrence, and he's more or less unharmed. He's sleeping, but he's on this little shelf. He's tucked up against this tree. But interestingly, the tree had this bough that was fairly elastic, and it had clearly been placed over his neck, basically trapping him tight up against the mountain. It was like he had fallen into a trap, because the police said that had he moved suddenly, he would have broken his neck the way he was positioned. So the police carefully undo the branch, and they bring the boy down, which was a total task considering how far up they were. And he's unharmed. He's a couple scratches on his face, but that's about it. They have no idea how he, one, got 7 miles away and then over 400 meters up a sheer cliff, so 1,400 feet up a sheer cliff that adults needed climbing equipment to get to. And then how did you survive the below freezing temperatures? You were out here for nearly a week. Nobody knows. On October 19th, 1973, James and Carol Duffy decide they want to go camping. So they have this big RV camper and they load up their 2 kids, Jimmy, who was 2, and Natalie, who was a little over 1 year old. They load them in the RV along with their 2 cats, and they take off for Lake Wenatchee, which is in the state of Washington. It's this beautiful campsite where lots of people with RVs would park right up against this lake. So they make it to Lake Wenatchee, they park their RV, they all get out, they're going on a little walk, but the kids seem fussy, and so Carol and James decide to put them down for a nap. Carol takes the kids inside the RV, she puts them down for a nap. They're in there with the 2 cats. She shuts and locks the RV and goes outside. At this point, James says he wants to go scout for a good hunting spot around where they were camping. And so James takes off and he's looking for a place to go hunting. And Carol decides she's going to walk a little ways around the lake, but keeping an eye on the RV the whole time. And also James was within eyesight of the camper as well. And after about 15 minutes, James goes back to the camper and checks on the kids. Carol would say she saw James doing that and kind of looked over to get the thumbs up from James to make sure the kids are okay. James goes in, the kids are sleeping, the cats are sleeping. James comes out of the camper, he shuts and locks it. He turns and he sees Carol. She's about 100 meters away, so a little over 300 feet away. He gives her a thumbs up and then actually walks over to her. So he's gonna go walk around with his wife now. So he makes it over to Carol, and they're walking a little bit farther away. So they're still only about 150 meters away from their camper when they hear a scream coming from their camper. When they both turned around, there was a big tree kind of obscuring their view to the camper. So they kind of ran back on the path to get a better look at their camper. And all they can see is the door to the camper is now open. So the two of them sprint over to the camper. James gets there first. He goes inside, and his son, Jimmy, is gone. Their youngest child, Natalie, was still sleeping, and their two cats were still sleeping. Remember, Carol and James were on the other side of this lake about 100 meters away when they heard this screech coming from the RV. It seems odd that the cats and Natalie wouldn't wake up to that, but they didn't. After an initial frantic search of the area where they can't find Jimmy or any sign of Jimmy, they call the police, they show up, and they begin doing a search themselves. And after 2 hours of aggressively combing this whole campsite and talking to all the other people that were there wasn't that many people there, so they were able to interview everyone, and everyone had an alibi. No one was near their camper. The police start to feel really suspicious about Carol and James. And in fact, they straight up accuse James of hurting his child and trying to cover it up. But James and Carol swear they were on the other side of the lake there. They heard that scream. They ran over. This is what we found. And so for 4 days, there's this massive search with canines, helicopters, you name it. They are combing the area. They're interviewing everyone they can. There is nothing, no sign of this child. And so the suspicion that Carol or James had something to do with the disappearance of this child only grew. And so eventually both parents were subjected to a polygraph test, and both stuck to their story and both passed. They had nothing to do with the disappearance of their child. They were telling the truth. The police still felt like there's something off here about these parents. They must have had something to do with this. And so they really dug into their backgrounds and the family backgrounds, talking to friends and family. And every single person in this family's circle and even outer circle said, no, they care about their kids. They would never harm Jimmy. But through their digging, one thing that did come up is that Jimmy was actually considered a very frail child that basically couldn't do anything without assistance. So between the polygraph test that rules out the parents as being potentially responsible, and now this information that Jimmy was this very frail child who's also 2, right? He didn't get up, open the camper, escape, and then evade this massive search effort. You know, that didn't happen either. So all you're left with is abduction. But the police, they basically cordoned off this whole site and were able to account for every single person that was in the park at any time while the Duffys were there. And every single person had an alibi and completely checked out. Eventually, the search for Jimmy was terminated, and to this day, almost 50 years later, we still have no idea what happened to Jimmy, where he went, and how he got there. Late at night on March 26, 1962, the Crawford family, who lived in Tennessee, noticed their 1-year-old was sick, so they wanted to take her to the doctor's office. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford hop in the car with their 1-year-old, and they bring along their 3-year-old named Faye. They drive to the doctor's office. Turns out the 1-year-old's going to be just fine. They give the kid some medication. They head back to their house, and when they pull into the driveway, Mr. and Mrs. Crawford turn around. The 1-year-old is awake, but the 3-year-old, Faye, is fast asleep. So the parents look at each other and they say, okay, we'll get the baby inside. We'll give Faye a couple more minutes to sleep inside the car, and then we'll come out and we'll get her. So Mr. and Mrs. Crawford carefully get the 1-year-old out without waking Faye up. They shut the door, they lock it, the windows are up. They go into the house, they put their 1-year-old down, and literally maybe a couple of minutes goes by. They come out and the doors are still shut, but Faye is gone. Now, because the vehicle was still shut, they're thinking, oh, she must have gotten out of her seat and maybe is tucked under the seats. So they run over and they look inside, and Faye's nowhere to be found. She's not in the vehicle. So the vehicle itself had only 2 doors. There was 2 rows of seating, but only 2 doors. If you were in the back seat, like Faye was, you would need to push down, fold down one of the 2 front seats and then open that door to get out. But both door handles on the inside were broken off. They did not work. You would have to manually roll down a window and then reach outside the car and use the outside door handle to open either door. So the parents are looking at the vehicle, and the doors are shut, the windows are up, everything is still locked. And while it is possible that Faye could have, in theory, got out of her car seat, folded down one of the 2 front seats, rolled down a window, reached out, opened the door, got outside, rolled the window back up, push the lockdown manually and then shut the door again. That is possible. It's extremely unlikely. And she had never done that. She'd never even gotten her own seat undone, let alone that complicated maneuver of getting out and re-shutting the door and locking it. So obviously the police are called, they show up, they're searching the area, they can't find this child, and then it starts to snow and the temperatures start to drop. So the police and volunteers stay out all night. There is no sign of this child, and the Crawfords are bracing for the worst. The next day around 11 a.m., 3 miles away from where Faye went missing, she walks onto the property of someone's house. She was barefoot, but she was more or less okay. Obviously the parents are elated. They're so happy their daughter's okay. Now, normally when somebody goes missing, the investigation stays open until they're discovered. If they're discovered alive, even if the circumstances are really weird, because they're alive, it more or less ends the investigation, because what are you looking for at this point? They're found, they're alive, everything's okay. It's rare that an investigation would continue after they've been found. And in this case, the police left the investigation open because they couldn't understand how Faye could have gotten out of that vehicle, considering how difficult that would have been. And how did she get 3 miles away in less than 12 hours in the middle of the night walking through a forest? Not to mention, historically, kids are creatures of habit. If they're missing and they're in the middle of the woods, but it's nighttime, they don't just keep walking. They lay down and they go to sleep. And then when the sun comes up, they get up and then they keep moving. So for her to have gone 3 air miles from where she went missing to this farmstead, that means she did not lay down and go to sleep. She kept walking all through the night. So none of it added up. And then when they asked Faye what happened, she would just smile and laugh. That's all they could ever get out of this child. So despite leaving the investigation open, no one ever came to any sort of conclusion about how she got out of that car and how she covered that distance or why. It's just a big mystery, like all of these missing 411 cases. In 2001, Paul Wayment was 37 years old. He was a construction worker living in Salt Lake City, and he was about to get divorced for the second time. In his first marriage, after the divorce, he got sole custody of their 4 children. He was a great father. The judge saw it that way and said the kids were better off with him. And following this second divorce, he would file for sole custody of the child that they had had together, who was a little boy, 2 years old, named Gage, and he would win. So Paul is a single father of 5 children. Gage was a lot younger than the other 4 kids, and so he kind of became Paul's little buddy and went everywhere with Paul. They were very, very close. On October 25th, 2001, Paul takes Gage, puts him in the back of his truck, he buckles him into his car seat, and the two of them head off to this area where Paul would hunt for deer. It was actually a private deer hunting area that was totally enclosed by a fence. Now, in order to access this private area, you needed to be a member, and Paul was a member, and once you become a member, they give you a gate code. And so Paul and Gage drive up, he gets to the gate, he punches in the code, he opens up the gate, the two of them drive in. He said he shuts the gate and locks it, and the two of them head up this path to this area where he planned to look for some deer. When he parked the car, he saw that Gage was passed out in his car seat and just did not look like he was going to be psyched to get out and go look for deer. Paul thinks about it for a minute and he decides, you know what, I'm going to leave Gage in the back seat. I'll just shut and lock the car. He's warm, he's taken care of. I'm going to go spend just a couple of minutes looking for deer and then I'll come back and I'll get him. So he hops out, he locks the car, and he walks a little ways away from the truck where it's still right behind him. But a couple of other hunters that were on this area, they saw Paul, they flagged him down, and they started talking. He gets preoccupied, and after 30 minutes or so, he realizes he needs to go back and check on his son. And when he goes back up, the front door on Gage's side is open and Gage is gone. Paul runs up to the vehicle. He can't believe that Gage is gone. Paul screams for the other hunters to come over and help him. He's like, I can't find my son. They start looking in the area, and apparently Paul was so grief-stricken, he began vomiting. He was totally hysterical, and he kept saying, it's my fault. It's my fault. I left him here. Police show up, and this massive search is launched. But you got to remember that this is a gated-in area. Everything is locked. You need to have a code to get in here. And the only people that apparently were on this site at the time were the other hunters that Paul was talking to. And so obviously that casts a huge spotlight on those hunters and Paul being responsible for whatever's happened to Gage. But initially they just focus on looking for this child. And after a little bit of searching, and there's absolutely no sign of this kid, they do turn on Paul. He's like, you know what, if anything happened to my son, it's my fault. I left him in the vehicle, it's my fault. Like, he's not being defensive at all. He is 100% saying, it's my fault, I did this. He's not saying I harmed my child, but he's taking full responsibility for whatever's happened. And the police pick up on that, and they're like, you know what, I think he's telling the truth. And he's also saying that he was with those other hunters, and they're the only other ones here. So for 4 days, this massive search is launched all over this hunting area, even beyond the hunting area, and there's no sign of this child. He's just gone. And so they terminate the search, but Paul's church offered to send another 150 volunteers to continue the search. And one of those volunteers was a man by the name of James Wilkes. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he brought along his dog, Dino. And over the course of this search, James and his dog actually get lost, which David Paulides says is very rare. There's so many people doing the search at one time, it would be hard to get lost, but it does happen. And so James and his dog wind up miles away from where they were supposed to be searching. They don't know where they are, they're lost. And so that night, the temperatures are dropping, it's snowing, and James and his dog ended up getting under a tree, in this little pocket under a tree, and they huddled together all night. And James said it was one of the worst nights of his life. He didn't sleep much, but at some point in the morning when the sun started to come up, he was happy to be alive. You know, he didn't die of hypothermia. And he and Dino start walking. And they've only walked a couple of minutes when the dog stops and he starts licking something on the ground. And he looks down, and under a couple inches of snow, it's the body of Gage. James scoops up the body, and for hours they start walking back kind of generally towards where he thinks he needs to go. He ends up finding a fence that he recognized. And since he was exhausted from carrying the boy, he placed the boy's body near a fence post that he knew he'd be able to recognize. And he and Dino made their way up to the search and rescue headquarters, told them where to find the boy's body, and they went back and they collected the boy's body. Now, because James is the one to find the boy, they immediately had to treat him like a suspect. They polygraphed him because you found the boy, no one else has found him, you're ways away from the search, but he passed his polygraph. James would say to police that when he found the body, there were all these tracks around the body. They looked like canine tracks, but they weren't Dino's, and he knows they weren't Dino's because he was holding onto Dino all night, and he hadn't been in this particular area the night before. So investigators are like, if there were other canine tracks all over that area, it means, one, we searched it, but if we searched it, why didn't they pick up on the boy, who they're trained to smell? Or what animal was this? Did it have anything to do with why Gage is here in the first place? After the autopsy, it was determined that Gage died from hypothermia. His father was absolutely devastated. You know, he spent all this time at the site where his body was found. He created a shrine for his son. He was known to spend hours in his vehicle trying to figure out how his son got out of his seat and then made his way out that front door, something he had never seen his son do. He was just totally devastated, and he was ultimately charged with negligent homicide, and he pled guilty to it and was given 30 days in jail, but before his sentence was carried out, he took his own life. In 1969, Robert Winters was a 78-year-old retired logger living in Oregon. He was a family man, he loved the outdoors, and he really loved going hunting with his 3 sons. In early October 1969, Robert and his 3 sons headed off for their annual hunting trip that they would do at Sparks Lake. Now, Sparks Lake is an area that they had been hunting for 20 years. They know this area inside and out. They arrive at Sparks Lake and they set up their camp right at the base of this mountain that was a part of the area that they would be hunting in. And for the first couple of days, everything was going great. On October 8th, they found out that there was this big snowstorm coming in later that night. They still wanted to go hunting that day, so they decided that instead of going up into that mountain and hunting up there, they would stay at lower elevation around where their camp was. So the 4 of them split up and they took up different positions all around this lake, but they're all in the same general vicinity, and they all hunt for the day, and then they all come back to the campsite that night. Except Robert didn't come back, and as it got darker and the snow started to fall, His sons got really worried and they went out looking for him, but quickly saw that we got to get other people involved in this because this snowstorm's coming in and we don't know where he is. So they call the sheriff's office. The sheriff's department launches this massive search right away, but unfortunately, over the first 24 hours, not only did they not find Robert or any sign of where he was, but over 18 inches of snow dumped all over the area. Because of the snowfall, it made searching the area on foot really difficult, so they called in a couple helicopters to scour the area from the air. And it was at this time that one of the helicopters picked up tracks at 7,100 feet right near the lake. And the tracks were actually discounted, and people said that can't be Robert's because that would mean he would have had to go up almost 2,000 feet in elevation when he and his sons had all agreed we're not going to go higher because of the snow. And Robert was an accomplished outdoorsman that would know in an emergency survival situation, especially in a cold environment, you don't go uphill. Temperatures drop as you go uphill. Risk of hypothermia increases, plus you're burning more energy trying to get up a mountain. So they said that cannot be Robert's tracks. 5 days after Robert went missing, no sign of him has been found, and the search was terminated. 9 months later, a doctor was on vacation in the same area near Sparks Lake, and he discovered next to a tree up around that area where those tracks had been found by the helicopter at 7,100 feet, he found lying against a tree a rifle, some clothes, a boot, a glove, and a pair of glasses. The doctor informed the sheriff's department, who came out and confirmed that these all belonged to Robert Winters, but oddly enough, there was no blood anywhere on the clothes. And there were no bone fragments or any remains anywhere in the area because they brought searchers out and combed that whole area. So there was no indication that Robert had actually even died. Even stranger was it looked like the clothes had been removed on purpose. Everything was stacked neatly next to this tree. The only other new piece of evidence that we would ever find about him is a year later, his dentures were found in that area. So again, there's no remains of Robert, just his various belongings that were found in that area. The family wanted to move forward with funeral arrangements, but they needed the coroner to sign a death certificate. The coroner refused for over a year, saying there's no sign he actually died. But eventually the coroner said it's also impossible for him to be alive at this point. So they were able to get a death certificate even though there was nothing ever found of him. It seems very unlikely that Robert, who was a skilled outdoorsman who had hunted this particular area for 20 years, and had agreed with his sons that it was a bad idea to go up in elevation because of the storm, defied all of that and went almost 2,000 feet up in elevation, removed his clothes neatly and put them on the ground next to a tree, and then vanished without a trace. But then how do we reconcile those tracks that were seen from the helicopter up near where all of his belongings were found? Unless those tracks weren't Robert's. On February 19th, 1999, Dr. Catherine Wong, who was a pediatrician in San Jose, California, she was 47 years old. She and her husband, John, along with 2 relatives and 2 of their 3 kids, drove 4 hours northeast from their home in Milpitas, California, to Bear Valley Ski Resort. The family loved to go skiing any chance they could, so Dr. Wong was actually a fairly skilled skier. This would be their first time at Bear Valley Ski Resort, which is a resort located about 30 miles south of Lake Tahoe. The Wongs arrive, they start skiing, it's this beautiful day. At about 11:30 in the morning, everybody stops and goes into the lodge for lunch. After lunch, their kids and the other relatives decide to stay in the lodge for a little bit longer, so Dr. Wong and her husband John decide to go skiing on their own. And at some point, Dr. Wong and John decide to go down separate trails. John goes down his trail, and Dr. Wong would go down her trail, which was not a difficult trail. It's one she'd been on earlier in the day, and she doesn't show up at the bottom. John's down at the bottom, he's waiting for her. After a little bit of time, he starts to think, okay, maybe she got hurt, maybe she fell down, I'm not sure. He starts making his way over and looking up the trail. He can't see anything. There's no indication that someone's been hurt. And he starts looking for another 20, 30 minutes. Can't find her. Ski patrol goes up and they're looking for tracks coming off of the trail, a sign that maybe someone fell off and went into the woods. But there's no tracks anywhere of somebody leaving the trail. So the ski patrol gets in touch with the sheriff's office, who come out and launch an absolutely massive search. But by the end of the day, there was no sign of Dr. Wong, and even more strangely, they had searched all 75 trails on Bear Valley Ski Resort, and there was not one indication that someone had skied off of any of the trails or even walked off any of the trails. The search continued for another 2 days, no sign of Dr. Wong. They began reviewing all of the security footage, and any instance where she was on camera, there seemed to be nothing wrong. At the end of that second day, the weather got much worse, temperatures dropped, and this huge snowstorm rolled in, and the folks in charge of the search decided it was too dangerous to continue. Plus, at this point, they believed that it was impossible for Dr. Wong to even still be alive. At this point, they told the family that they are considering Dr. Wong deceased, and they terminated the search. It was around this time that newspapers and people in the area began to speculate that this was not an accident, that either Dr. Wong willingly decided to vanish or foul play was involved. There was no proof of either one, but it just seemed so bizarre that there was this massive search and there was just no sign of her anywhere, no tracks, no anything. It just felt like something's amiss here, we just don't know what it is. Her husband John ended up taking a lie detector test, which he passed, and investigators began digging into their marriage a bit to see if there was some underlying problems, and it looked for all the world like it was 20 years of a very stable, healthy, happy relationship. There was no sign that Dr. Wong would be looking to, escape her life and run off with someone else. 4 months after she went missing, her remains and ski equipment were found about a half-mile south of the ski resort in this deep ravine, heavily forested, well off any marked trail. Bone fragments and remains were scattered over a quarter-mile trail along this ravine. This area had not been previously searched because when they initially launched this search for her, this area was so steep and so difficult to get to, plus there was 8-foot snow drifts from the ski resort all the way to that area, that they decided it would have been impossible for her to get there. So how did she end up in this impossible area, and why weren't there any tracks leaving the mountain? Some say the scarcity and dispersal of her bones over that quarter-mile track indicates that after she had been deceased, animals had kind of ravaged her remains. Others say that an animal is responsible for this attack, and that's why her remains are scattered over a quarter-mile track in this impossible area. But what kind of an animal is able to sneak up and grab a person off of a very populated ski resort and drag them this half-mile away without leaving any tracks or raising any suspicion? In 1991, Corey Fay was a 17-year-old high school student in Beaverton, Oregon. On November 23, 1991, Corey and 2 of his friends decided to go elk hunting. Corey was not an avid hunter, but he went hunting enough that he was competent, and he had taken survival training and was always very well equipped anytime he went out on a hunt. So the 3 of them load up in a truck, they make their way out to this hunting site, and when they get there, they decide to split up and meet back up at the truck at 6:30 that night. That night at 6:30, the other 2 hunters came back to the truck, but not Corey. He was nowhere to be found. The other 2 hunters briefly went out looking for Corey, and they couldn't find him, so they called the sheriff's department, who comes out and they launch this absolutely epic search. They had helicopters, they had horse teams, they had 250 ground searchers. They had 7 of the world's best scent sniffing dogs in the whole world are a part of this search. In over 10 days, that group covered 12 square miles where Corey would have been. Towards the end of this 10-day period, when this all-star search team has come up with nothing, people began to wonder if the other 2 hunters had accidentally shot and killed Corey and maybe buried him. But those search dogs never found a gravesite. The official search was called off on December 1st, but many volunteers stayed out for weeks and weeks, combing the area, going well beyond the bounds of that initial 12-mile area they searched, and nothing was ever found. The sheriff's department that was in charge of this search was so perplexed by the fact that this amazing team of searchers couldn't find anything that they ended up contacting the FBI, which indicates they were suspecting foul play, because that's the only reason the FBI would get involved. But almost nothing happened in Corey's case for nearly a year. In September of 1992, 2 hunters were hunting about 10 miles away from where Corey had gone missing, and they discover a rifle, a backpack, and a jacket. They don't know whose it is, so they turn it over to the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department comes out, and they're able to confirm that they all belonged to Corey Fay. A new search was ordered right around that area where his belongings were found, and all these searchers came out and did a grid search, and all they could find were a couple of bone fragments and his tooth. No large bones, no rib cage, no skull, nothing. And interestingly, they also never found his pants or his boots. But now that they had some of his remains, the sheriff's department was looking at where they were found, and looking at the time of the year when he had gone missing. And they realized that to go from where he went missing to 10 miles away, 3,000 feet up in elevation to where some of his remains were found, he would have been in waist-deep snow for over 5 miles. People were skeptical about him making this trek because it didn't make sense, but his family in particular really didn't believe it. Corey's grandparents said in an interview that Corey had taken these survival courses that he would talk about all the time, and one of the main things they teach you is in a survival situation when you're on a mountain, in particular when it's cold, you never go up. If you go up in elevation, temperatures will drop, the risk of hypothermia increases. So for him to have wound up 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation is basically doing the opposite of what he was trained to do. And his grandparents said that Corey was incredibly level-headed. There's no reason that in a real survival situation that he would have just thrown that out the window. He would have relied on his training. So the million-dollar question is, why are his belongings and bone fragments 10 miles away and 3,000 feet up in elevation? Did he defy his training and go there on his own, or did an animal attack him and drag him there? But if it's the latter, what kind of animal drags a 17-year-old, his rifle and his backpack 10 miles up 3,000 feet of elevation in over 6 feet of snow? And where is the rest of him? All we ever found were a couple of bone fragments and a tooth. In the early 1990s, a man turns on his camera, flips on his light, and starts filming. As the viewer, all we can tell is that he's in this gray hallway. It's very unclear where he is. It does appear to be something that might be underground because everything seems to be concrete. As he's filming, he begins walking down this narrow corridor where there's nothing on the walls or on the ground or anywhere to give away where he is. And so for the first 40 seconds of him just walking down this kind of meandering hallway, it's very uneventful. Then at some point, he aims his camera at what looks like an arrow that's been spray painted on the wall. He looks down at the ground and there's another arrow. He starts to follow the arrows and he's filming each one as he comes across them as he goes farther and farther off of the main hallway. And at some point the arrows bring him to this room, which at first you can't tell what it is. But then as the camera focuses, you see that there is this massive pile of human remains, skeletal remains. The guy filming does not seem alarmed by what he's seeing. In fact, it seems like he came here knowing he might come across this room full of human remains. After staring at this room for a few moments, he doesn't go in, but instead turns and continues following these arrows and strange markings on the wall and the ground as it brings him farther and farther down this other corridor to more rooms with more skeletal remains. And at some point, he comes to a full stop and he's looking at one of these rooms and something spooks him. It's unclear what it is because to this point, he's been very nonchalant about this horrible thing he's looking at. It didn't seem to faze him at all, but something did spook him because he's standing there and then all of a sudden he starts sprinting down the hall. Now, it's clear at this point in the video that he is alone down here, or at least he thinks he's alone down here, but he's running as if someone's chasing him. And he just takes off down this hall. The camera is now dropped to his side. He's not even trying to film what's in front of him. You hear his breathing and it's very panicked. And at some point he kind of trips and drops his camera and the camera comes to rest in this puddle looking right up against the wall. So you don't have a clear view of where this guy is or what's going on. And all you hear is his panicked breathing and his rapid footsteps as he continues to run down the hallway and eventually just disappears and it's totally silent. And at some point the camera runs out of batteries and it turns off. 10 years later, a group of urban explorers would find this man's camera where he had dropped it 10 years earlier in one of the scariest places on Earth. Hundreds of feet below the streets of Paris, France, lies one of the world's largest mass graves. It's known as the Paris Catacombs, and it's about 200 miles of intricate passageways that loop all over the city of Paris, where over 6 million people have been buried. The reason all these people were buried down there is because by the 17th century in Paris, the cemeteries in the city were overflowing, and so the decision was made to move their bodies down underneath the streets of Paris into these tunnels that were built in the 13th century for mining but had not been used in hundreds of years. And so they began packing in all these people to the tune of 6 million bodies before they ultimately stopped doing that. Starting in the late 1800s, the catacombs became sort of a popular tourist destination, but only a tiny section of the catacombs was made open to the public, meaning there are literally hundreds of miles of passageways in the catacombs that are totally sealed off to the public. No one goes in there, even though many people believe in these forbidden sections of the catacombs, there are entrances to additional levels of the catacombs, that there could be as much as 400 miles of passageways in the catacombs just waiting to be explored, but no one's allowed to go in there, at least not legally. There is an entire community of people that are sneaking into the forbidden section of the catacombs by going through sewer drains and getting onto train tracks and sneaking into these little cracks in the side of the walls. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous. It involves wriggling your way into these 13th century tunnels that are unmapped, pitch black, and no one knows you're there. Not to mention, you're surrounded by literally millions of dead people. Once people started figuring out how to sneak into the forbidden section of the catacombs, there's been countless stories of these urban explorers sneaking in, getting lost, and never coming out again. Which is exactly what we think happened to the guy with the camera who saw the arrows and then ran away. His camera was located miles and miles into one of those forbidden sections. In 2014, Kenny Veach was an avid long-distance hiker that spent lots of his time hiking around the Mojave Desert in search of caves and abandoned mine shafts to go check out. Sometimes he'd bring his girlfriend with him, but most of the time he was on his own, and he would stay out for a couple of days at a time. Kenny was constantly on YouTube watching hiking videos and anything to do with the Mojave Desert. And Kenny was a regular commenter on all of those types of videos. In June of 2014, Kenny must have watched this video called Son of an Area 51 Technician because he had left this comment where he was telling the community that had watched this video that he had had a very strange thing happen to him when he was out hiking near Area 51. For those that don't know what Area 51 is, it's a highly confidential United States Air Force installation that is frequently looped into alien conspiracy theories. Kenny goes on to describe this strange event, and he said he found this cave entrance on the side of this mountain that was shaped like an uppercase M. As Kenny walks up to enter this M-shaped cave, he said his body started to vibrate and it stopped him in his tracks. And he said he didn't know what it was, but as he walked closer and closer, his body just continued to vibrate to the point where he said he just had to turn around and leave, that he knew something was wrong with this cave and he could not go inside. And so he said he turned around and he left. His comment got a lot of traction on this video, and a lot of people jumped on and were like, well, I don't really believe you, one, but if that is true, you gotta go back. You gotta go back there and explore it. You gotta document this. Whatever this is, we want to know what it is. They were basically egging him on to go back and check it out. Kenny responded to his critics and said, I'm telling you the truth. I know what I saw. This cave was different. I go out in the desert all the time looking for caves, and I go in them. That's what I do. This one was different, and that's why I didn't go in it. But people just kept egging him on to go back and check it out and to film it, show documentation of this thing. And so finally he agrees. A couple of months later, Kenny goes back out to the Mojave Desert with his camera, and he films himself looking for the M cave, but he can't find it. So the video's kind of a bust. He still uploads it to YouTube, and he tells everyone that he's gonna go back out again. He knows where it is. He's fairly confident that he can get to it again, but he just needs to go out a third time to go look for it. Over the course of the next month, in the comment section of that video, people are encouraging Kenny and saying, go out there, go find it, we're so excited. One commenter was not so encouraging. Their name was Lemmy Killmeister, and they wrote on his video, do not go to M Cave. If you go in, you won't be able to get out again. Kenny wrote back, what do you mean? And Lemmy Killmeister didn't respond and subsequently vanished from YouTube. Kenny brushes this off, and on November 10th, 2014, he heads back out once again to try to find M Cave. On November 14th, when he had not returned and his girlfriend had not heard from him and couldn't get in touch with him, she called the police. The police launched this massive search for Kenny. They knew roughly where he was going to be because he had documented it so aggressively on his YouTube channel, and so they search in that area, and after about a week they find his cell phone, and it was laying outside of an abandoned mine shaft. Now, immediately, searchers think, well, he must have fallen into this mine shaft that was almost a vertical mine shaft. He must have fallen in there to his death. So they get a camera and they feed it down into this mine shaft, and there's no one in there. And very clearly, no one had been down this mine shaft in a very long time. Certainly not Kenny. There were no tracks around where his phone was located, so no animal tracks or people tracks. And the phone didn't have blood on it or scratches on it. It was just sitting there with no new information. Beyond the cell phone, they had nothing else to go on, and eventually the search was terminated. Kenny never turned up. He was just gone after that. While it's pretty easy for people to chalk up this whole M Cave thing as total nonsense and that they believe all that happened is Kenny went out into the wilderness of the Mojave Desert and ultimately got lost and died, and that's fair, I do want to offer up one thing about his description of being near the cave, that first time he saw it. He described his body vibrating to the point where he couldn't go any further and he had to turn around and leave. The United States military uses these things called access denial systems around their highly classified installations. Anywhere where you cannot risk someone getting in, like a fence isn't good enough, they use these machines that fire beams at people that get too close. They're non-lethal, but it's like being thrust inside of a microwave. You feel hot and really uncomfortable, and you turn around and you get the heck out of there. The fact that Kenny was right near Area 51, a highly confidential area, regardless of alien conspiracies, it's a known highly confidential base. And he's discovering this strange cave entrance that doesn't look like other cave entrances, and he's walking up to it describing basically what it feels like to be hit with an access denial system. It makes you wonder, did he discover some secret entrance to some secret base? Or is this a bunch of crap and he just got lost in the desert and died? We don't know. But what we do know is that his search for M Cave probably ended his life. And that's why you should never go looking for M Cave. As the sun began to set on August 18th, 2010, Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, walked to the end of the pier, put on all of his diving equipment, and jumped in the water. He slowly descended 115 feet and came to a stop right in front of a very famous underwater sign. The sign very clearly tells anybody who sees it, do not go any farther unless you are absolutely certain this is the right thing for you to be doing. If you go farther, you're probably going to die, like the 300 other people that have died doing this particular activity. He swam right past that sign and went 300 feet to the very famous underwater locked gate. Now, the only people that have keys to this are extremely experienced divers, and even they don't typically go into this area because it's so dangerous. Ben was not one of the very experienced divers that was given a key, but he still desperately wanted to get to the other side of the gate. So he's sitting there yanking on the gate and he's getting himself kind of pushed inside halfway through the gate and he can't quite get it open. And another diver saw him doing this and was actually concerned that Ben was going to get trapped on the gate itself and would just drown on the gate. And so this diver comes over and uses his key and maybe against his better judgment opened it, thinking that that was better than him getting stuck on the gate. Ben turns to look at him, gives him a nod, thank you, and he, on his own, swims into one of, if not the single most dangerous underwater caves in the whole world. It's called Vortex Spring Cave. From the locked gate, this cave extends another 1,600 feet and goes down to a depth of 310 feet. The majority of this section of the cave is mapped, but there are sections that are not fully explored because they're so narrow, where you have to literally take off your gear, wriggle through a hole, pull your gear through and put it back on. All the while you're barely holding onto your mouthpiece. And so really the full extent of this section of the cave is not known. While we don't know exactly what Ben did when he went through that gate and entered into this extremely dangerous cave, we do know that he didn't come out again. And after a couple of days and no one had seen him, they launched this massive search for him and they combed as much as they could of inside of that cave, but there were sections that they were just not prepared to go search. And so he was never recovered. All they ever found were 2 of Ben's dive bottles. As a total side note, when I was reading about the Vortex Spring Cave, it reminded me of some of the things that we did when I was in the Navy SEAL teams. And one of my least favorite things to do is when we would be swimming in and around ships. We would go under barges. And so a barge has a flat bottom. And sometimes they sit really close to the bottom of the ocean, but there's a little space under there where you can maneuver. And so we would go underneath these barges where there was only a few feet of clearance. And it's totally pitch black. and you're swimming in just total blackness where you're so claustrophobic. You're basically tight in this little space where you're just hoping that nothing causes this barge to sink on me. And by the time you get out the other side, it's like this huge sense of relief. And so that's why this is number one on my list, because for me, the idea of being trapped in a little tiny alcove inside of an underwater cave where you can't get out, you're running out of air, it's pitch black. I mean, that is just the absolute worst way to go.